The crowd outside the modest grocery store seemed to lock in place as if time itself had stalled. A sleek black Bentley screeched to a halt at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the dull gray of a suburban Boston plaza. This was Dorchester, a place where aging sedans and delivery vans were the norm, not ultra-luxury cars that looked like they belonged on magazine covers. People stared, confused and curious, sensing that something completely out of the ordinary was about to unfold. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out with a presence so commanding it felt unreal. She was tall, poised, and moved with effortless confidence, every step deliberate. A cream-colored jumpsuit hugged her frame, and her red-soled heels clicked sharply against the cracked pavement. Her chestnut hair was pulled back neatly, diamond earrings catching the afternoon sun. A gold watch flashed so brightly that a few onlookers instinctively shielded their eyes. This was Catherine Hayes, a name recognized far beyond Boston. She was the tech billionaire behind Helios Dynamics, a regular face on Forbes and Fortune, one of the most influential women in the country. People whispered her name in disbelief. Catherine Hayes wasn't someone you expected to see in a rundown parking lot. She wasn't here for an interview or a business deal, and she certainly wasn't here for groceries. She walked straight past the stunned crowd toward a man standing beside a line of shopping carts. He held a broom, sweeping brittle leaves off the sidewalk with slow, practiced movements. His navy uniform was faded and creased from years of washing, his dark hair unkempt, stubble shadowing his tired face. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground, as if avoiding the world entirely. The man looked up when he heard the sound of heels approaching, startled by attention he never received. No one ever approached him willingly, especially not someone who seemed to exist in a completely different universe. Catherine stopped less than a meter from him and smiled, not the polished smile from magazine covers, but something softer and unexpectedly genuine. "My name is Catherine," she said calmly. The man blinked several times, as though trying to confirm he wasn't imagining this. "Ethan," he replied, his voice rough and unused. "Ethan Cole." Before anyone could react, Catherine spoke again, her tone gentle but unwavering. She told him she had been watching him for weeks, coming here almost every day. She had noticed how he spoke to customers, not because it was required, but because he truly listened. She had seen him patiently explain math to a child, calmly walk someone through their change, and speak with the warehouse manager about efficiency like someone deeply familiar with systems and data. Her heart pounded as she admitted she didn't know his story, but she believed he didn't belong here, that he only needed someone to see him and give him a chance. Ethan stood frozen, stunned by words no one had ever said to him. Then Catherine took a breath, steadying herself. She said she was about to ask the most outrageous question of her life. Looking directly into his eyes, she asked if he would marry her. The sidewalk seemed to lose its air. An elderly woman stopped mid-step. Teenagers gaped, and phones shot into the air as people began recording. Ethan's mouth fell open. This had to be a joke, some elaborate prank. A woman like her proposing to a worn-out janitor made no sense. A bitter smile crossed his face as he told her that if she was serious, she should go inside, buy a ring, come back out, kneel down, and ask again like she truly meant it. The crowd buzzed with disbelief, but Catherine didn't hesitate. She turned and walked straight into the store. Minutes later, she returned holding a small black velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring worth tens of thousands of dollars, brilliant enough to silence everyone watching in front of dozens of strangers. Catherine Hayes knelt on the dusty pavement. Her voice trembled as she asked Ethan Cole to marry her. The world erupted around them. Laughter, tears, traffic slowing as drivers leaned out their windows. Ethan looked down at her, eyes burning. He nodded, barely able to speak, and whispered yes. Catherine slipped the ring onto his rough, calloused hand, and for a moment he stared at it like it belonged to another life entirely. She stood and told him to get in the car. Ethan hesitated, glancing at his uniform and worn shoes, murmuring that he'd dirty the seats. Catherine brushed it off, saying leather could be cleaned, but moments like this couldn't. He folded his apron carefully, like a quiet goodbye, and stepped into the Bentley. As the car pulled away, the man who thought life had erased him had no idea his story was only beginning. If you stayed with this moment, think about what you just witnessed. A billionaire kneeling before a janitor on a public sidewalk. Where do you think this story is headed next, and what would you have done in her place? To understand how this unbelievable moment came to be, we need to rewind 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks before that day, Catherine sat alone in her corner office on the 47th floor, Boston glowing beneath her like a sea of stars. A 4-hour board meeting had just ended. Revenue was up, stock prices had hit record highs, and a massive international deal had closed. On paper, her life was flawless. Yet the emptiness inside her felt louder than ever. The room was filled with priceless furniture and art, but there was no warmth, only the hum of air conditioning and the steady tick of the clock. Her gaze drifted to a photo on her desk. Her daughter Lily, smiling in a pink dress on her 5th birthday, was the only thing that still pulled Catherine out of bed each morning. Her phone buzzed with a message asking if she could come home for dinner, apologizing for slightly burnt macaroni. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as she wondered how many moments like that she had missed. Money couldn't buy back bedtime stories or quiet dinners. She thought of her parents, Thomas and Grace Hayes, who had raised her in a small Brookline home filled with books and music. They had taught her that success meant love, not wealth. They died in a car accident when Catherine was 25, just as her company began to thrive. The last conversation she had with her mother ended with impatience, words she would regret forever. When the hospital called in the middle of the night, her world collapsed. Years later, there was Michael, her husband. They met in college, fell in love quickly, and built what seemed like a perfect family. When Lily was born, Michael stayed home while Catherine built her company. They made plans for the future, plans that vanished the morning Michael disappeared without a trace. No note, no explanation, just absence. Lily was too young to understand, and Catherine was left holding questions that never found answers. She survived by burying herself in work, growing her company into a powerhouse while her heart slowly froze. One evening, exhausted and distracted, Catherine realized her refrigerator was empty and stopped at a small grocery store she'd never visited before. As she wandered the produce aisle, she heard a calm voice explaining math to a child. Turning, she saw a janitor crouched beside a boy, patiently breaking down numbers with clarity and kindness. Something about the way he spoke made her stop and listen. And for the first time in weeks, Catherine forgot about everything else. Catherine couldn't shake the image of the janitor explaining numbers with the patience of a seasoned teacher. She stood there longer than she realized, apples growing heavy in her arms, watching as the boy's face lit up with understanding. The man smiled briefly, a small, almost forgotten expression, then returned to his work like nothing remarkable had happened. But to Catherine, something had shifted. She left the store that day unsettled, her mind replaying the scene over and over as she drove home through traffic she barely noticed. The next afternoon, she found herself turning into the same cracked parking lot again, telling herself it was coincidence. The day after that, she returned once more. Soon, she stopped pretending there was a practical reason. Each visit revealed more moments that didn't align with the job Ethan Cole was doing. She saw him help an elderly woman find medication, asking careful questions about her health and gently advising her to speak to her doctor. Another day, he calmly guided a young employee through inventory software, explaining systems and logic that sounded far beyond basic training. Catherine watched from a distance, unnoticed, as Ethan spoke with the store manager about seasonal buying patterns and customer behavior. He mentioned trends, efficiency, and optimization with the ease of someone who had once lived in that world. The manager listened politely, but clearly didn't grasp half of what Ethan was saying. Catherine did. These were concepts she had spent years mastering, strategies discussed in executive boardrooms, not grocery aisles. Every encounter left her more certain that Ethan's presence here was wrong, like a brilliant instrument locked away and left to gather dust. Curiosity turned into concern, and concern into determination. Catherine didn't want to intrude, but she had resources and questions that wouldn't let her sleep. Quietly, discreetly, she looked into his background. The surface details were sparse. Ethan Cole, early 40s, employed at Freshmart for 3 years, living alone in a small apartment nearby. No criminal history, no debts, no listed family. It was as if his life had started over recently. But when Catherine dug deeper, another version of his name appeared, one that made her breath catch. Ethan Cole, Ph.D. in data science from MIT, former lead analyst at a top consulting firm, guest speaker at major conferences, a TED Talk on predictive modeling that had once drawn millions of views. Then, 5 years ago, the record stopped cold. No updates, no appearances, no explanation. It was as though that man had vanished. Catherine sat back in her chair, stunned, staring at her screen late into the night. The pieces didn't make sense, yet they fit together too perfectly to ignore. She didn't know what had broken him, but she knew something had. And she knew this wasn't a man who had simply failed or grown lazy. This was someone who had fallen off a cliff and somehow survived the fall, clinging to existence without purpose. The more she thought about it, the more a strange conviction took root in her chest. He didn't need charity. He needed belief. He needed someone willing to see him as more than what life had reduced him to. One sleepless night, staring at the ceiling while Lily breathed softly in the next room, a reckless idea surfaced. Offering Ethan a job would never work. He would see it as pity, a handout from a wealthy stranger. He would retreat further inward. Whatever she did had to be undeniable, impossible to dismiss. The idea scared her, made her laugh at herself in the dark, but it refused to leave. It followed her into meetings, into dinners she barely touched, into moments with her daughter. 3 weeks later, Catherine made her decision. That decision led directly back to the sidewalk outside Freshmart, to the stunned crowd and the impossible proposal. Now, as the Bentley moved smoothly through Boston streets, Ethan sat rigidly in the passenger seat, clutching a worn canvas bag like an anchor to reality. The hum of the engine and soft jazz on the speakers felt unreal. Only hours earlier, he had been invisible, sweeping leaves and avoiding eye contact. Now he was engaged to one of the most powerful women in the country, and he had no idea how or why. Catherine glanced at him quietly. His eyes were bloodshot, not from tears yet, but from years of exhaustion and sleepless nights. She had 1,000 questions, but she held them back. This wasn't the moment to pry open wounds. He needed space to breathe, to feel human again. She told him they had one stop to make. Ethan nodded without asking where. When the car pulled up on Newbury Street, he stared at the glass storefront of an upscale grooming salon, marble floors gleaming inside. The staff's practiced smiles faltered briefly at the sight of Ethan's uniform and tangled hair, then snapped back into place when they recognized Catherine. She told them simply that he was with her and that she wanted the best they offered. Before Ethan could protest, she stepped back outside, leaving him to unfamiliar hands. For the next hour and a half, he sat in silence as layers of neglect were slowly stripped away. Hair washed, cut, and styled. Beard shaved carefully. each stroke of the razor peeling back years of self-imposed armor. As his reflection changed, memory surged. His late wife, Emily, teasing him as he shaved years ago, telling him she liked him better with a beard. He had grown it after her death and never removed it, as if it were the last thread connecting him to her. Now it fell into the sink, strand by strand. Tears slipped down his cheeks, blending into foam. When the barber asked if he was hurt, Ethan forced out a breath and told him to continue. When it was done, they handed him a mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back. His face looked sharper, older, but alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. His eyes were still heavy with sorrow, but something faint flickered there. A spark he thought was long gone. Fresh clothes waited for him, tailored perfectly. He hesitated, memories of funerals and black suits clawing at his chest, then stepped into them anyway. Catherine rose when he emerged, her breath catching. The man before her was the one she had sensed all along, hidden beneath grief and dust. Ethan stood awkwardly, unsure where to put his hands, murmuring that he felt like he'd come back from the dead. Catherine smiled gently and told him this was only the beginning. They returned to the car and drove on until tall iron gates opened to reveal her home. Ethan stepped out slowly, overwhelmed by the quiet grandeur of the house and the warm light spilling from inside. The scent of lavender hung in the air. From the staircase, a small girl appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her curly hair wild. Lily looked at Ethan with cautious curiosity and asked who he was. Catherine introduced him as her friend, who would be staying with them. Lily studied him seriously, then asked if he was a good person. Ethan bent to her level and answered honestly that he was trying to be. That night, after dinner in silence filled with unspoken thoughts, Ethan stood on the balcony watching the city glow. Catherine joined him with 2 glasses of wine and finally asked him who he really was. He stared at his hands for a long time before speaking. He told her about his life before Freshmart, about the career he had loved and the family that defined him. His voice was steady at first, then began to fracture as he spoke of a winter morning, a rushed goodbye, and a promise he never fulfilled. He described the plane crash that took his wife, his children, and his parents all at once. The way grief hollowed him out until there was nothing left but breath and habit. Catherine listened, tears streaming freely, as he spoke of identifying bodies by personal items, of funerals and bottles and years spent wanting to disappear. When he finished, the night felt heavy with shared pain. Catherine told him her own story then, of loss and abandonment, of building an empire while feeling like a ghost inside it. They sat together in silence afterward. 2 people who had both believed their lives were already over. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir that wasn't just pain. It was fragile, uncertain, but real. As dawn crept closer, neither of them noticed the passing hours. For the first time since everything had ended, Ethan felt the faint desire to keep going, to see what might come next. Ethan woke to the sound of birds outside the window, sunlight slipping through sheer curtains and warming the unfamiliar room. For several long seconds, he didn't move. He listened. The house was quiet but not empty, filled with the subtle sounds of life beginning its day. The scent of fresh coffee drifted up from downstairs, rich and grounding. Peace settled over him so gently it almost frightened him. He wondered how long it had been since he'd felt anything like this, without pain chasing close behind. Then doubt hit him all at once. He sat up sharply, half expecting the room to dissolve, convinced the previous night had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. But the bed was still beneath his hands, the light still real, the silence intact. A soft knock sounded at the door. Before he could answer, it opened slightly, and Lily peeked inside, her hair a mess of curls and sleep. She smiled shyly and told him breakfast was ready and that there were pancakes. Her excitement was contagious, and Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. Downstairs, Catherine sat at the dining table already dressed for the day, sunlight catching the calm strength in her face. The table was covered with food that looked almost unreal to him. Eggs, bacon, pancakes stacked high, orange juice glinting in glass. She told him to eat, watching closely as he did. When he asked why she sounded so insistent, she replied simply that he'd need energy because he was starting work that day. Ethan nearly choked. When she explained that he'd be working at Helios Dynamics, he stared at her, stunned, insisting he was outdated and unprepared. Catherine didn't waver. She told him skills like his didn't disappear. They only went unused. All he needed was time and belief. When she reached across the table and took his hand, her touch was steady, grounding him in a way nothing else had for years. He didn't say yes out loud, but something inside him shifted. That afternoon, Ethan walked beside her into the glass tower of Helios Dynamics, feeling like a relic stepping into the future. Inside, everything gleamed. Screens glowed, voices buzzed with purpose, and people moved with confidence. Eyes followed Ethan as he passed, whispers trailing behind him. He felt the old familiar cold creep into his hands, the instinct to disappear. Catherine led him to a corner office overlooking the city. On the desk lay a card welcoming Ethan Cole as Director of Strategic Data Analytics. He froze, barely able to breathe. When he protested, Catherine reminded him she was the CEO and didn't need permission to believe in him. Not everyone shared her confidence. During his first leadership meeting, the skepticism was immediate. David Reynolds, the CFO, questioned Ethan's credibility, pointing out the 5-year gap in his professional history. The room went silent as Ethan spoke the truth. He told him about the grocery store, the janitor job, and then about the life he'd lost. No embellishment, no defense. Just facts delivered calmly. When he finished, the room was heavy with unspoken emotion. He promised only one thing, that he would earn the chance he'd been given. The weeks that followed were brutal. Technology had evolved rapidly, and Ethan felt like a beginner in a field he once mastered. He spent 12 hours a day relearning tools, studying frameworks, filling notebooks with frantic handwriting. There were nights he sat alone staring at his screen, convinced he didn't belong, convinced he was an imposter waiting to be exposed. But then he remembered Catherine kneeling on concrete, her faith unshaken, and he kept going. Slowly, the fog began to lift. Patterns emerged. His instincts returned, cautious but sharp. A month later, he stood before the board presenting a discovery no one else had seen. Inefficient resource allocation was draining millions annually. His proposed solution could save the company nearly $18 million a year. Charts filled the screen, logic solid and precise. When the chairman praised his work, even David Reynolds softened, admitting his mistake. For the first time in years, Ethan felt pride without guilt. Life outside work changed too. Catherine began coming home earlier, laughter returning to the house. Dinners became a routine, stories shared across the table. Lily talked endlessly about school, about friends and small dramas that felt enormous to her. Ethan listened, careful not to overstep, content simply to be present. But Lily kept her distance, a quiet wall between them that he respected even as it hurt. One evening, when Ethan tried to read her a story, Lily shook her head and asked for her mother instead. Ethan stepped back without protest, but as the door closed, he heard Lily whisper that she didn't want a new dad. She wanted her old one to come back. The words hit Ethan like a blow. He stood in the hallway for a long time, hand pressed to his chest, understanding too well what it meant to miss someone who would never return. A week later, Lily refused to come down for dinner. Ethan knocked gently on her door, asking if he could come in. She agreed reluctantly. Sitting beside her, he waited until the silence broke. Lily burst into tears, asking why her father had left her. why he hadn't loved her enough to stay. Ethan chose his words with care, telling her he didn't know why her father made that choice, but that it was never her fault. When she cried harder, he pulled her into his arms, sharing his own loss, telling her that missing someone meant they mattered. They sat together until her sobs faded. Then, in a small, fragile voice, Lily asked if she could call him Dad. Ethan's breath caught, tears blurring his vision. He told her she could if she wanted to. She smiled, small but genuine, and told him she was hungry. That night, something inside Ethan healed in a way he hadn't known was possible. Dawn autumn settled over the city, painting everything gold. One evening, Catherine and Ethan sat together on the balcony, the air cool and quiet. Ethan asked her why she had done it, why she'd taken such a risk. Catherine thought for a long time before answering. She told him she had seen kindness in him when he thought none was left, patience where there could have been bitterness. She said she believed some people weren't finished yet, no matter how broken they seemed. Ethan admitted he'd thought she was crazy. Catherine laughed softly, saying maybe she was, but some things were known by the heart before the mind could catch up. When they leaned toward each other, the kiss they shared was tentative, careful, filled with the understanding of two people learning how to love again after devastation. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. A month later, during a quiet dinner on the rooftop, Ethan stood and asked Catherine to listen. Lily watched with wide eyes as he knelt, holding a ring he'd bought with his own salary. He spoke of the day she had knelt for him, of the life she'd given him back piece by piece. When he asked her to marry him, Catherine cried openly, saying yes through tears. Lily cheered, throwing her arms around them both. Their wedding was small and intimate, held in an old Cambridge church. As Catherine walked down the aisle holding Lily's hand, Ethan felt a joy so sharp it almost hurt. When he spoke his vows, he promised not only love but remembrance. The promise that he would never forget the moment she saw him when he could not see himself. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, a blessing rather than a spectacle. A week later, they visited the cemetery together. Ethan placed flowers on 5 graves, apologizing for the years he'd spent believing happiness was betrayal. He told them he wanted to live now, to honor them by continuing. Catherine stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, sharing the weight of the moment. As they left, the air felt lighter, as though something long carried had finally been set down. Years passed quietly and beautifully. Ethan became co-CEO through merit alone. Lily grew into her laughter, calling him Dad without hesitation. When Catherine discovered she was pregnant, both of them cried, overwhelmed by joy and disbelief. On a spring morning filled with blossoms, their son was born. Holding the baby, Ethan whispered a greeting filled with gratitude and hope. Lily promised to protect their little brother, and in that moment, their family felt complete. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. The months following Wyatt's birth unfolded with a quiet rhythm that felt almost sacred. Sleep came in fragments, broken by soft cries in the night and the gentle shuffle of footsteps along the hallway. Ethan learned the language of bottles and burp claws, of rocking motions that soothed and humming tunes he barely remembered learning. Catherine moved through those nights with a calm strength, her confidence extending far beyond boardrooms into the fragile space of new life. Lily took her role as older sister seriously, hovering close, correcting adults with solemn authority when she thought they were holding the baby the wrong way. The house that once felt cavernous and echoing slowly filled with warmth. Mornings became louder, messier, and infinitely richer. Breakfast turned into shared rituals, pancakes on Sundays, rushed toast on school days, and laughter woven into the smallest moments. Ethan found himself present in ways he had never imagined possible again. The ache of his past never disappeared, but it softened, no longer sharp enough to steal his breath. Instead, it existed alongside joy, a reminder rather than a wound on at Helios Dynamics. The changes were just as profound. Ethan's role expanded steadily, not because of his marriage, but because of his results. He approached leadership with humility shaped by loss, listening more than he spoke, building teams instead of hierarchies. Employees who once whispered about the former janitor now sought his guidance, drawn to the quiet clarity he brought into chaos. Catherine watched this evolution with pride, careful to maintain professional boundaries that protected both their credibility. Not everyone approved. There were murmurs in boardrooms and subtle resistance from executives who resented the shift in power dynamics. Ethan faced those moments without bitterness. He responded with data, transparency, and consistency, letting results speak where words would fail. Over time, skepticism faded into respect. When the board formally voted him into the role of co-CEO, the decision felt inevitable rather than symbolic. Ethan accepted it without ceremony, understanding too well how fragile titles could be. Catherine changed as well in ways she had never predicted. Success no longer demanded her entire being. She left the office earlier, declined meetings that could wait, and learned to silence the constant pull of urgency. In the evenings, she sat on the living room floor with Lily, helping with homework, or leaned against Ethan in quiet moments when words were unnecessary. The empire she had built remained strong, but it no longer defined her worth. Lily's transformation was perhaps the most striking. The guarded child who once feared replacements slowly relaxed into trust. She spoke openly about her biological father, not with anger, but with sadness that found space to exist without being overwhelming. Ethan never tried to erase that past. He honored it, acknowledging the place it held, while offering something steady and present in its wake. Over time, Lily's laughter returned fully, unburdened by the fear of losing what she loved. One autumn afternoon, the family visited the cemetery again. Leaves blanketed the ground in shades of gold and crimson, the air crisp and still. This time, the visit carried less weight. Ethan stood before the familiar stones with gratitude instead of apology. He spoke softly, sharing news of a life rebuilt, of love found again, of children growing. Catherine stood beside him, Wyatt asleep in her arms, Lily holding Ethan's hand. The moment felt complete, not because grief was gone, but because it no longer stood alone. Life continued forward, shaped by challenges that felt manageable rather than crushing. There were disagreements, exhaustion, moments of doubt, but none carried the power to dismantle what they had built together. When Wyatt took his first steps, Lily cheered louder than anyone. When Lily performed in her first school play, Ethan watched with tears streaming freely, unashamed of emotion. Catherine captured the moment on her phone, her smile wide and unguarded. Years passed, marked by growth rather than survival. Helios Dynamics expanded into new territories, guided by leadership that valued people as much as innovation. Ethan spoke occasionally at conferences again, not about data alone, but about resilience and rebuilding. His past became part of his narrative rather than its entirety. Audiences listened not because of his credentials, but because his words carried lived truth home. Evenings settled into peaceful routines. Stories before bed, quiet conversations after the children slept, shared glances that held entire histories. Catherine and Ethan learned to navigate partnership with patience, understanding that love after loss required gentleness. Their bond deepened through shared vulnerability rather than grand gestures. It was built in everyday choices, in staying present even when memories resurfaced unexpectedly. One winter night, as snow fell softly outside, Ethan stood by the window holding Wyatt, watching flakes drift under the streetlights. Memories surfaced, as they often did, but they no longer overwhelmed him. He felt the past beside him, not behind him, integrated into the man he had become. Catherine joined him, resting her head against his shoulder, and together they stood in silence, content. Lily padded into the room, half asleep, asking to be tucked back in the bed. Ethan carried Wyatt to his crib, then followed Catherine upstairs. As he tucked Lily in, she wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered that she felt safe. The words settled into him deeply, anchoring everything he had fought to reclaim. He kissed her forehead, knowing that safety was not something he could promise forever, but something he could offer sincerely, day by day. The house grew quiet again, filled with the soft sounds of breathing and the distant hum of the city. Catherine and Ethan returned downstairs, sitting together on the couch where so many conversations had unfolded. They spoke about nothing urgent, about plans that extended only as far as the weekend. The simplicity felt like a gift. Once, their lives had been defined by extremes, unimaginable loss, and overwhelming success. Now, balance existed between them. As the years continued, their story spread quietly through those who knew it, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder of what belief could restore. Ethan never forgot the sidewalk outside Freshmart, the moment when someone chose to see him fully. Catherine never forgot the courage it took to trust her instinct in a world that valued logic above all else. That moment remained the foundation beneath everything else. Unshaken by time, their family stood as living proof that broken beginnings did not determine endings. Love, when offered without conditions, had the power to rewrite trajectories that once seemed final. The wounds they carried became places of connection rather than isolation. Together, they moved forward, not untouched by the past, but no longer defined by it, building a life rooted in presence, compassion, and second chances. 3 years had passed since the day a black Bentley stopped outside a forgotten supermarket and turned 2 invisible lives inside out. Time had moved steadily, not in dramatic leaps, but in thousands of small moments stitched together into something solid and enduring. Ethan no longer woke each morning startled by silence or dread. He woke to the sound of footsteps, children's voices, and the ordinary chaos of a home that was alive. That ordinariness felt like the greatest miracle he had ever known at Helios Dynamics. Ethan's role as co-CEO had become unquestioned. The board no longer saw him as Catherine's husband or a redeemed curiosity, but as a leader who delivered clarity where others brought noise. His background, once whispered about, became a source of respect. He understood failure, grief, and rebuilding in a way spreadsheets could never teach. Under his guidance, teams were reorganized not just for efficiency, but for sustainability. Burnout dropped, innovation rose, and the company's culture quietly shifted. Catherine watched this evolution with a deep, private pride. She had once built her life around proving herself to the world. Now, she found fulfillment in balance. She still commanded rooms and closed billion-dollar deals, but she also left meetings to attend school events and answered late-night questions from Lily about friendship and fear. The sharp loneliness that once haunted her success had faded, replaced by something steadier and warmer. Lily, now 8, moved through the house with confidence. She no longer hesitated before calling Ethan Dad. The word came easily, naturally, as if it had always belonged to him. They had their rituals: bedtime reading, pancake Sundays, summer afternoons watching baseball together. Ethan never tried to replace the father she lost. Instead, he became the one who stayed, the one who listened, the one who showed up consistently. For Lily, that consistency became the definition of love. Wyatt grew quickly, his presence anchoring the family in the present. His laughter filled rooms, his first words celebrated like national holidays. When he stumbled learning to walk, Lily was always there, cheering him on with fierce devotion. Catherine and Ethan often watched their children together, sharing glances that held gratitude too deep for words. This was the life neither of them had believed possible anymore. One evening, After the children were asleep, Ethan stood alone on the balcony, looking out at the familiar spread of Boston lights. Memories came, as they still did. Faces from his past surfaced gently now, without tearing him open. He allowed himself to remember Anna's smile, his children's laughter, his parents' voices. Instead of guilt, he felt connection. Instead of longing to disappear, he felt rooted. Catherine joined him quietly, handing him a glass of wine, and they stood together in silence that felt full rather than empty. On the anniversary of the plane crash, Ethan returned to the cemetery alone at first, then later with Catherine and the children. The visit was no longer about apology or self-punishment. He spoke openly, telling them about his life now, about joy rediscovered and pain transformed. Lily placed flowers carefully, asking questions with curiosity rather than fear. Wyatt toddled nearby, unaware of the significance, grounding the moment firmly in the present. Ethan felt peace settle over him, a deep, lasting calm. Their story, though never publicized by intention, slowly traveled through quiet conversations and private retellings. Employees shared it with new hires. Friends spoke of it in moments of doubt. Strangers found inspiration without ever knowing the full truth. It wasn't the spectacle of a billionaire's proposal that endured, but the meaning behind it. The belief that someone was worth seeing, even when the world had already looked away. One night, years after that sidewalk moment, Ethan asked Catherine if she ever regretted it. She thought for a long time before answering. She told him that logic had warned her against it, that fear had screamed at her to walk away. But she had learned that courage wasn't the absence of doubt, it was choosing to act despite it. She said kneeling that day had been the most honest decision she had ever made. Ethan smiled softly, understanding her more deeply than ever. He told her that she hadn't just given him a second chance. She had reminded him that his life still mattered. That reminder, he said, had saved him. Catherine leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. Both of them aware of how thin the line had once been between survival and surrender. As the years continued, their lives remained imperfect, touched by stress, disagreements, and lingering grief. But those imperfections no longer threatened to undo them. They had learned how to hold pain without letting it define them, how to love without demanding guarantees. Their home became a place where emotions were allowed, where silence wasn't feared, and where healing didn't have a deadline. The sidewalk outside Fresh Mart remained unchanged. Just another patch of concrete to passers-by. No plaque marked what had happened there. No sign told the story. And yet for Ethan and Catherine, it was sacred ground. It was where belief stepped in when hope had run out. Where one life reached for another without knowing how the story would end in the end. This was never just a story about wealth or status, or even about love at first sight. It was a story about seeing what others overlook, about choosing compassion when indifference is easier. It was about understanding that broken people are not finished people. And that sometimes the bravest act is to kneel before someone the world has already dismissed. Ethan often thought about the man he used to be, sweeping leaves and counting days, convinced that nothing awaited him. That man still existed in memory, but no longer in fear. He had been carried forward, transformed by a single moment of belief. And every morning, when Ethan woke to the sound of his family, he honored that moment by choosing to live fully, deliberately. And with gratitude. If this story has followed you all the way here, then perhaps it has touched something personal. Perhaps it has reminded you of someone you almost gave up on, or a part of yourself you stopped believing in. Stories like this endure not because they are rare, but because they reveal what is always possible. One decision, one act of faith, one second chance,